so much, Matt, and thank you, Michelle, and hi, everybody. So this is the part in my talk when I would normally say, it's a pleasure to be with you. And of course it is a pleasure to be with you, but it feels like more than that. With everything that's going on in the world, and especially in the United States, it feels like more than that. It feels like it's important to be here with you, and it feels meaningful to be able to help welcome you to this week and this gathering together. It feels important that you're here, that you've come together in shared learning and in making sense of this moment. It feels important that you've come together in community and in optimism and hope for the future. You wouldn't be here if you didn't have optimism and hope. So it is more than a pleasure to be with you. It feels like a privilege. So thank you. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this. When Michelle and Molly first invited me to speak, and that was many months ago, the world felt like a much calmer place, at least on the surface. We knew, of course, that the impacts of climate change were growing, but then the pandemic hit, and now we face new levels of unrest and uncertainty. But what I've noticed in this time is that the things I would like to share with you this afternoon and the things that Michelle and Molly invited me to share have only become more relevant over time, to find our way into greater alignment with life, into a story that invites us into greater alignment with life and life's ability to thrive is the only viable way forward, in my opinion. It's the only way we're going to make it through these many crises we face. So I'm happy that we're here together. I'd like to take you through the agenda that I have. And now, here we go, share screen. All right, so this is how I'm envisioning our time together unfolding. I'd like to take about 30 minutes to share some thoughts about the story that we're living within now and that we're struggling within, and also the story that we see emerging and what it might mean for you. And then I'd like to invite you into some small group breakout conversations. And then we'll all come back together for a whole group facilitated open discussion so that we can make sense of everything that I'll share and what it means for your context. And my recommendation, my suggestion is that if you have questions during my presentation, that you type them into the chat. And then while you are in the small group conversations, I will look at your questions and be ready to come in with some thoughts during the whole group discussion. I think that's going to be a good use of our time together. And then at the end, we'll spend some time reflecting on what are you leaving with, and I'll offer some thoughts about what you might listen for during the rest of the conference to carry forward the learning from what I've shared. So before I start my talk, there's one more thing I'd like to do. As Matt said, it would be wonderful if we could be together. And if we were together, I imagine that you would all really like to check in with each other and ask, how are you? And how have you been in these strange and challenging times? So I'd like to offer a bit of space and time for that kind of a checking in, but with a couple of adaptations because we aren't together in person. So the first adaptation I'd like to offer is a twist on that question, how have you been? So that we can get right to the heart of things as quickly as possible. This is the question that I'd like to offer. What has surprised you about your experience of these past few months? What has surprised you about your experience of these past few months? So the second adaptation that I'd like to offer is that I'll invite you to type your answer to this question into a Google document. And Molly will share the link to that Google document in the chat right now. If you are unable or unwilling to make your way into the Google document, that's fine. You can write your answer in the chat, but it's just so much easier to craft a response and edit it in that format, and then also to see what other people have written. So we'll take 2 minutes and share our answers to this question, and then we'll take another 2 minutes to read what other people have written, and we'll get a sense for what we've all experienced and what's common and what's different. Okay, so what has surprised you about your experience of these past few months? And I'll meet you over in the Google document. All right, it's time to finish your thought, and then let's take another couple of minutes to read through what others have written. All right, let's make our way back together into the Zoom screen. Thank you, everyone, for sharing those really thoughtful responses. And it's a range of experiences and emotions that I think we're all feeling. So thank you for sharing that. It feels appropriate to bring that context into our conversation and into this space of community. So if you don't mind, I'll share what has surprised me about my experience of these past few months. As Matt said, I live in Montreal. I'm originally from the US, but I've lived here for about 15 years. So I wondered if the view from Montreal would be very different from the view from New Hampshire, but reading your responses, it looks like it's not so different. So what I've seen is that much, like almost all of the population of the planet has come together behind a common cause. And in an incredibly short amount of time, we've dramatically changed our behavior individually and collectively. And that makes me believe that we could dramatically change our behavior in other ways too. And that encourages me. I feel like suddenly new things are possible that we didn't think were possible 6 months ago. So what surprises me is that even in all this upheaval and change and uncertainty, I feel more hopeful than I have in years. And some of you may have seen an article that's been popular on social media. It's by an author named Arundhati Roy. She wrote an article for the Financial Times recently, and in it she talks about this sense of new possibility that I'm noticing too. And I want to share a quote from this article because I find it so powerful. She writes, "Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it." So this crossing through a portal into a new world, to me, requires that we think differently about our organizations and our communities. It requires that we think differently about their purpose and our role within them. And it requires that we expand what we believe is possible. And this rethinking and expansion of what we believe is possible has been the focus of my work for the past 20 years. As Matt said, I worked previously for 2 major multinationals, and then I moved into organizational development and employee engagement. And in both of those phases of my career, I had this sense that we were missing something fundamentally important in how we engage employees, how we engage customers, how we interact with the community. So I had that sense that we're missing something, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. And around the same time, the sustainability movement started to rise to public awareness, to the mainstream. And I had this instinct that all of those things were related, that that's something missing and this disaster that's looming on the horizon, we're connected in some way. So I went in search of that something missing. I went on a quest and dedicated my life to figuring that out, to figuring out what is it that guides the decisions we make, and what might help us make better choices, wiser choices that were more aligned with the ability for life to thrive. So what I found in my research and in my work since then with a wide range of organizations and communities is that we are guided by a dominant story, a worldview, a paradigm that tells us that everything in the universe operates like a machine, especially our organizations, right? It tells us that our organizations exist for the purpose of productivity and profitability alone. And in that story, we exist only to compete and consume, you and I. That is our purpose. And in that story, we are separate from our organizations. We are resources to be entered into the machine. And we're separate from each other, and we're separate from nature, right? Does it sound familiar, that story? So this story has shaped every aspect of our lives, from how we structure learning, how we design and approach healthcare, how we grow our food, how we structure work. And it's not that this story is completely wrong, it's that it's not complete. The story is not complete, and it leaves out really important aspects of the plot of the story. And in doing that, it leads to some pretty significant problems. In fact, I'm convinced that every major problem that we face in society can be traced back to this machine story, this reductionist mechanistic story, that's the root of our every major problem. And what's especially challenging is that from within that story, we can't imagine different ways of being. These actions are the only ones that make sense. These outcomes are the only ones that are possible within the logic of the machine story. So it's a trap, this story of ours. But fortunately, there are signs that a new and more complete story is emerging. A story that tells us that everything doesn't operate like a machine, but instead that life operates, that the earth and we and our organizations operate more like an ecology of living systems. And in business, one point of evidence for the emergence of this story is this explosion of new vocabulary and new approaches that we've seen over the past years. Things like social innovation, impact investing, the sharing economy, and of course, social responsibility. And none of these terms, none of these approaches make any sense within the machine story, because all of them have an expanded story at their foundation, a story of alignment with life. Impact investing makes no sense when the only impact we're after is more profit for shareholders, right? Why would we need to specify impact investing? The sharing economy, why would we share? And why would we have any further responsibility than to generate more profit for shareholders? This is evidence that there's an expansion to the story taking place. And of course, anything that is complex and regenerative and self-organizing and resilient must be alive. These are properties of living systems and things that machines are not capable of. So these are signposts pointing the way towards an expanded and more life-aligned story. My contribution to this explosion of vocabulary is this term, thrivability, the ability of life to thrive, and our capacity to serve that, to create the fertile conditions for life to thrive at all levels, for individuals, for organizations as living ecosystems, for customers, for community, for the biosphere. And to me, what this takes is the informed intention and practice of creating fertile conditions for life to thrive at all of those levels. The informed intention and practice. So informed because if we're going to create the conditions for life to thrive, we need to know, what does that take? What does that involve, and what does it require of us? We have to be informed. And then we have to set that as our clear and explicit intention. Right now, in our businesses and our societies set their intentions on something far less than enabling life to thrive. And as a result, we're getting something catastrophically less than life thriving. So it's critically important that we get clear that the point is to enable life to thrive. That's our intention when we come together. And finally, it's important that we see and recognize that it's an ongoing practice. It's not a marketing campaign, and it's not a certification program. It's a life practice, an individual and collective life practice, like a martial arts practice or a spiritual practice, where we are continuously deepening in wisdom and compassion and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So that's the challenge before us, to enter into this informed intention and practice. And if we start with the first part of that equation, the informed part, I'd like to share what I've learned in my research and my work with different organizations and communities about those fertile conditions. What does it take to enable life to thrive? And what I have found is that there are four core conditions that are present in any living system, whether it's our bodies or a rainforest or an organization or a community. I think of these as life's universal design principles. So I'd like to share those with you. And I will warn you, there is a very small amount of biology involved, and you will understand it, and it is intuitive, and you've got this. And there won't be a test at the end. So let's do it. All right, so here they are all at once. These are the four universal design principles that we find everywhere we look. So I'll describe them in a general sense, and then I'll give you a few examples to make it clear, including how these show up in our organizations, okay? So in any living system, there are diverse parts that come together in patterns and structures of relationship in a way that enables the emergence of a new whole, a new level of life with emergent capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. So that's the magic that we're after, right? Where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And what powers that magic, what makes that whole process happen, is life. It's that spark that animates us and makes us alive. And we don't need to know where does that come from or what is it, but we have to acknowledge that life is what is powering this whole process in self-integration and self-organization, that life elegantly enables parts to integrate into a unified whole. So anything that is alive is self-organizing, self-generating, self-regenerating, self-integrating. So if we look at a forest, in a forest we have different trees and countless other species, right? And they come together in a structure and pattern of relationship, everything that supports and connects them in being together. So there are root systems and mycelial networks, the fungus that connects them. There's the living soil that supports and connects them. So nutrients and information can flow between them. And what results from all of that interaction is an emergent whole, a forest, a new level of life that isn't just a collection of trees. It's a new ecosystem. And here we find new capabilities and characteristics like rain. I recently learned that rain is a symbiotic biological phenomenon. It's not any one tree that's making the rain. It's that whole system, the whole forest system that makes that happen. And in all of that, it's life that is elegantly integrating parts into wholeness and making that all happen because it is alive. So we've all experienced these patterns and these conditions every time we've been in a really fantastic conversation. So if in a conversation there are diverse people bringing diverse perspectives. And if their exchanges are flowing and well supported and open and curious, and if the topic that brings them together is compelling and meaningful and important, and if those people are free to contribute to the conversation as they are inspired in self-organizing, self-integrating manner, then the conversation starts to take on a life of its own, an energy of its own. It feels like flow, and everyone within it is elevated. You feel smarter than you normally do, right, in those amazing conversations. And you find the emergence of new capabilities and characteristics, like new insights that no one could have come up with alone, right? So that's the magic we're after in our organizations, and that's how life works naturally. That's life's core urge, to connect with other forms of life in order to create emergent forms with new capabilities and characteristics, right? So let's talk about organizations and how all of this shows up in our organizations. So in organizations, we have diverse people who each have different gifts and contributions that they want to share and who want to be nourished in the process of sharing them. Those people are supported and connected in patterns and structures of relationship. We've got office space, we've got meetings, patterns and habits of coming together in meetings. We have Zoom, we have contracts and agreements. And all of that in human communities comes together when we have shared purpose. It's shared purpose that enables wholeness to emerge and enables us to come together in convergent wholeness so that new capabilities and characteristics can come together. But that only happens when that shared purpose is compelling enough, is meaningful enough, is powerful enough to act as a magnet to hold us together in shared purpose and shared action. Otherwise, we remain something of a shapeless crowd and we don't get the magic, right? And so let me tell you some of the emergent capabilities and characteristics that we find in organizations. We find the ability to take on complex tasks that we wouldn't be able to take on if we were just a crowd of people. We find that inspiration and insight and innovation that we start to see in conversations as well. And we see the emergence of healthy and nourishing culture as well, if all goes well. So what we're discovering over the past few years is that command and control, as if of a machine, is not actually the most effective way to guide and steward a group of living people. And instead, we're discovering more and more ways to support self-organization and self-integration so that these diverse people can find their own way to contribute as they're inspired, to contribute in inspired ways to that shared purpose that brings them together, right? So a key part of this shift in story is the shift in how we understand our role and how we see ourselves, from seeing ourselves as drivers of the machine and engineers and mechanics to seeing ourselves as gardeners and stewards of something precious and alive, whose potential we can't really know, but that we might serve and cultivate. So it doesn't mean that you can't control anything, but it means that what you're really trying to shape and control is those fertile conditions to allow life to self-organize and to emerge in ways that you may not have been able to predict, but that might surprise and delight you. So let me tell you a story about an organization that I've worked with and where these fertile conditions were at play. So this is for nature museums here in Montreal, a botanical gardens, an insectarium, a planetarium, and a biodome. The biodome is 4 ecosystems recreated under one roof. So you walk in and you're in the tropical rainforest, complete with trees and monkeys and birds and so on. So these are 4 institutions that were separate and independent, but all owned by the city of Montreal. And at one point, a few years ago, the mayor decided to merge them administratively. And it might have been a cost-saving initiative. Why have 4 HR managers when you could just have 1? You know, they're all nature museums. What's the difference? Let's merge them administratively anyway. So must have seemed like a good idea, but the employees were pretty horrified. They felt that they were each very distinct. They have different scientific disciplines, different histories, different sizes. The planetarium was actually in a different part of town. So they were not very interested in being merged. But it went forward, and the mayor hired a new director to oversee this merged entity. And the man he hired was and still is a visionary and charismatic man. And but unfortunately, or fortunately, he came from the world of circus. You might know Montreal is known for that. And so that kind of added insult to injury for the staff. They were really afraid that he was going to turn them into the next Cirque du Soleil, and that the science and education that they really care about would somehow not be honored. And then kind of the final blow was that his mandate was to create one brand that would represent all 4 of them together. And they were skeptical of marketing and branding, you know, and couldn't imagine how that could live together with the science and education that they cared so much about, that it could contain and portray the substance that they brought to the world. And so they were worried that they would turn into McMuseums. So my colleague and I were brought in to help them find their way through this situation. And one of the first things we did was to bring all 650 people together for a day. This was the first time they had all been together. And we guided them in participatory and creative ways to explore those 4 fertile conditions and what it would look like when all of those were fully cultivated across all of these 4 organizations. So we invited them to imagine, what will it look like when each of you is able to bring the best of your gifts and contributions and to be nourished in the process? What will it look like when your work flows beautifully, you're supported and connected, and collaboration is joyful and effortless? And to help them imagine that convergent wholeness, you know, the shared purpose that could hold all of them together, all 4 institutions, we didn't ask, what is the one thing that you all want to sell the world? What's the product or service that you really want to sell? Instead, we asked them, what's the one conversation you all want to have with the world? A conversation is something alive and evolving and emergent and co-creative, right? So this was the question we asked them. And throughout, we were guiding them in listening to the voice, what I think of as the voice of the whole. What's the urge that's present across all 4 organizations? And so, oops, sorry about that. This is how the associate director later described the process. She says, we actually listened to what was in the center, to what the organization wanted to tell us, and what does it want to become. So I think this is a beautiful way of describing stewardship. This wasn't a small leadership team that came up with a plan and drove it through the organization and got buy-in and all of those other mechanistic kinds of terms we usually use. This was a very organic process of stewardship of what's alive in the organization. So based on what we heard, we drafted a manifesto, a concise expression of those fertile conditions of what it's going to look like when, and I don't mean for you to read all of this, but it's just there. So it was a concise expression of all of those fertile conditions and what it will look like. And we brought this draft manifesto back to the directors of these 4 museums, and we asked them, is this what you all said? Does this feel authentic? What do you think? And they said, it's really good. It's good. We like it. There's just one problem. You used the word life. And we don't talk about life we talk about nature because we are scientists, you know, and nature is tangible and measurable. It's out there. We can see it and point to it. But life, I don't know, life is kind of amorphous. It feels unscientific. It might even be spiritual. So could you change that one word? And the director and my colleague and I, we all said, wow, this is really interesting. And it feels important. Most of you are biologists and you're uncomfortable talking about life. If you can't talk about life, then who can? And maybe there's a connection between our inability to talk about life and our decreasing ability to sustain life on the planet. Maybe this is actually the one conversation you all need to have with the world. You've said that you want to change people's behavior in relationship with nature. It's a harder sell if it's somewhere out there than if it's also somehow in here. So they went through the next several months of what I think of as collective soul searching to figure out whether they could go there. You know, could they actually talk about life and not only nature? And in the end, they came up with a new identity for themselves all together. And now, together, they are Espace pour la vie, which means space for life. And you'll see that they have retained their diverse individual identities. They are still the biodome, the botanical gardens, the planetarium, and the insectarium. But together, they form the space for life. They are integrated into this convergent whole. And they will tell you, this is not a brand. This is a commitment. This is a movement. This is a conversation. It's something that's alive and unfolding and co-creative. And when I first heard this phrase, Espace pour la vie, I thought, you know, that might be the perfect translation for the word thrivability, which unfortunately doesn't translate easily into French. But what I mean by it is that we can see our every organization and every community as a space for life, a space in which we can cultivate life's ability to thrive, right? So what did this mean for them? It wasn't just a change in name. It had significant implications for everything about them as organizations and as an organization. So one of the things that happened as a result of this process is that they changed the structure of their organization. So previously, human resources had been buried within finance and administration, which is a pretty common practice, but instead they created 3 pillars to their org chart. The first pillar they call people and culture. So that's the diverse parts of their living system, right? The second pillar they call infrastructure. So that's everything that supports and connects them in relationship, internally and externally. And the third pillar is visitor engagement. So that's that shared purpose that brings them together in convergent wholeness. And all of that is undertaken in a spirit of stewarding what's alive, right? So a second thing that came out of this process was that they got very intentional about shifting how they conduct meetings. And it's kind of a subtle thing, but previously it was a very bureaucratic organization, slow and heavy and sort of boring, not at all innovative. And because of this process, they just made a commitment to take care of anything that was slow and bureaucratic and boring by email. But if they were going to be together, they were going to pay attention to what people were energized about, you know, and what they could do together, what could generate new ideas and new possibilities together. And it made an enormous difference to the culture and to what they generated, actually, and became a really wonderfully innovative organization. So a third thing that happened is that they gradually transformed their exhibits and made them far more engaging and interactive and even co-creative, so that it was much more of a conversation with the world. So maybe the punchline of the whole story is that where they had tried and failed for 7 years to raise enough money to renovate that poor lonely planetarium on the other side of town that was in desperate need of renovation, they never could manage to raise enough money. But within 1 year of this process, they were able to raise $190 million and build a completely new planetarium on the same site as the other 3 museums. So there's something really magnetic in aligning with life, you know, and in setting those fertile conditions in motion and cultivating those fertile conditions. So this is the message that I'd like you to take away from my talk. If we're going to make it through all of these many challenges that we face, we're going to have to expand the purpose of work to suit the needs of this moment. The purpose of your work has to be to cultivate the fertile conditions for life to thrive. It has to be to shape every project as a practice ground for a more thrivable world. The world doesn't need more stuff and more solutions as much as it needs us to figure out how to be better humans together in wiser and more compassionate alignment with life, the life that we show up with, the life of our communities, the life of the biosphere. So to me, this is the full extent of social responsibility. And this is what every business has the potential to be a means to an end for. So I can offer you 2 ways to move forward, 2 things that you can do to move in this direction. And one is simple and straightforward, and one is not. So let's start with the simple and straightforward one. One thing that you can do is to pay attention to the language you use. And when you find yourself using mechanistic language and necessarily mechanistic thinking, then see what happens if you swap it out for more life-aligned alternatives. So I worked recently with an organization that called itself an umbrella organization for different community groups. And you can imagine how much more came into view, how much more seemed possible when they instead started to think of themselves as fertile soil for community projects, right? So if you find yourself talking about human capital or human resources, try talking about people instead and see what happens. If you find yourself referring to the supply chain, see what else comes into view when you talk about your business ecosystem. When you refer to leveraging something, this is a mechanical concept. See if anything else comes up when you talk instead about cultivating whatever it is you're talking about. And if somebody starts to talk to you about social capital, ask them if what they really mean is richness of relationships. Words make worlds. It's important which words we choose. So that's the simple thing. The not as simple, but very important thing that we can do is to ask bigger questions and have more courageous conversations. So we can ask, for example, what more could it mean for each of us individually to be able to bring the best of ourselves, to feel deeply at home in this work, in this place, and in our own bodies, and what could support that? And that goes extra for you if you are a leader, if you are hoping to guide people in this shift in story and in intention, because that's going to take courage. And so it will be important for you to figure out what will support you, what will help you feel grounded in inviting people into that kind of an exploration. We can ask, What more could it mean for our infrastructure and interactions to support not only information sharing, decision making, and effective action, but trust, playfulness, learning, and joy? For our patterns of belonging with colleagues, customers, and community to be infused with a sense of dedication, earnestness, flow, perhaps even sacredness. And what could support that? This shift in story and intention is going to require more meaningful conversations with more of our community and more of our ecosystem. We can ask, what are we called to express and create together in service of life? How can we be essential to this moment, uniquely capable of contributing some vital aspect of a more thrivable world? What is the wisdom that is needed now? And I think of wisdom as the integration of the needs of both parts and whole. If we can figure that out, how do we integrate the needs of both parts and whole? We will have found our way to wisdom. And there's a vital and often overlooked access point to that kind of wisdom and integration. And it's life. Life informs us in more complete ways than intellect alone about the wisdom that's needed. So we can ask, what would bring the most life to this process and this project? How can we be inspired, nourished, renewed, and even surprised by nature, beauty, art, music, movement, and celebration? And how can we allow life to flow through us so that we can truly savor this experience of being alive? This is a way not just to have a great time together, but it's a sort of portal into a fuller way of knowing, a fuller access to the wisdom that's needed. So it's a lot that I've shared with you. My hope is that you can lean on each other in finding the courage that you will need to engage in these conversations. It would be maybe a little bit terrifying to be alone, inviting other people into some of these big and courageous conversations that I'm proposing, but you're not alone. You have each other. And so my hope is that for the rest of this week, there can be plenty of individual learning, but that you can also be listening and discerning, as those 4 museums were, for what is the one conversation that you all want to have with the world, or at least with New Hampshire. What's the one conversation that you all want to have with your community, with New Hampshire? So this is the part where I would like to invite you into small group conversation to process and make sense of what I've shared. And first, I'd like to offer a couple of minutes just to reflect on your own. And here's the question that I'll offer for that reflection and for the small group conversation. What is fertile? Where are those fertile conditions already present in your organization? And what could use tending and cultivation? And if you're not comfortable or able to join one of the small group conversations, then that's fine. But I hope that you'll stay with us, or at least come back in about 15 minutes, because we'd love for you to be part of the whole group discussion that follows. So if that's you, then you'll get a pop-up invitation to join a breakout group, and you can just ignore it, but stay on the line or come back. For everyone else, I'd love to offer you 2 minutes to reflect on this question, and then you'll get that pop-up invitation, and it'll send you into a group with 1 or 2 other people, so you can compare notes on what came up for you in your reflection about where are these fertile conditions already present in your organization, and what could use some tending and cultivation. All right, as you finish putting your comments in, now I'll share my screen. And Oh, we did that. Okay. So as you go to other presentations, other workshops, as you learn about other tools, I invite you to listen for where it was individual contribution and sharing of gifts that made a crucial difference, or where new levels of belonging and more effective methods of collaborating were really important, or where it was a compelling and heroic cause that really brought people together. Where was that key to the story that you're hearing? And where did creative, inspired, self-organizing initiative and even wisdom play a key role? So this is part of the practice of tuning in and being able to recognize those fertile conditions at play. And then I warmly invite you to join me again at the end of the week on Friday afternoon, so we can compare notes and see what we each heard and where it seemed useful for our organizations and where we might go from there. And of course, I'd love for you to join the discussion group beyond the conference as well. So my closing thought is a quote from my book, that ultimately Thrivability is a quest, a hero's journey, a choose your own adventure story. The challenges we face in our organizations, in our communities, and in the world call for nothing less, and our own hearts crave nothing more. I'm thrilled to find that you are among the choir. It's wonderful to be with you, and I look forward to being in more conversation with you all throughout the week and beyond. Thank you so much.